Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Okay, so today we'll be taking the Culavedalla Sutta. This is Sutta number 44 in the middle-length discourses, and it begins on page 396. So the sutta is called in Pali the Culavedalla Sutta. The word Chula means shorter or small, because there's two Vedalla suttas. Number 43 is the Mahavedalla, which means the longer Vedalla Sutta. The meaning of the word Vedalla, it's not exactly clear because it's nowhere really explained very well. But both of the Vedalla Suttas take place as a sequence of questions and answers between two disciples, rather than between the Buddha and somebody who's interrogating him. And so it seems to be a kind of series of almost miscellaneous questions and answers, and usually they touch on quite deep and rather technical issues in the Dhamma. Okay, so this shorter series of questions and answers, it actually features a bhikkhuni as the chief responder. Or as actually the only responder. Yeah, her name is Dhammadinnā, and she was declared amongst all of the nuns, she was declared to be the nun who was the foremost in expounding the Dhamma. And so she must have given many other discourses which are not recorded and not preserved. If she's called the foremost of expounders, then she must have spoken many times. But this short, vague questions and answers sutta has come down as sort of the testament or testimony to her appointment in that position. And then the person that is speaking to her is a lay follower, a layman, whose name is Visākha. And the commentary gives a little background story, and it explains that Visākha had actually been the husband of Dhammadinnā before Dhammadinnā became a nun, when they were living the household life. So the commentary says that one day this man Visākha went to hear the Buddha give a discourse. And so while Visākha was listening to the Buddha give his discourse, he paid very close attention to the teaching. While the Buddha was explaining, he followed very closely the teaching, meditating on the teaching as the Buddha was giving it. And as a result, he went boom, boom, boom 3 times. And he reached the third stage of enlightenment, the stage of anagami. And one of the features or qualities of an anagami, a non-returner, is that he's completely eradicated what is called the fetter of sensual desire or sensual craving. And so after the discourse, he went back home, and he seemed very, very peaceful, but he kept some distance from his wife, Dhammadinnā, and he seemed very calm and peaceful, but also quite cool. He didn't show the usual signs of affection towards his wife. And so she asked him, "Is anything wrong? Did I do anything to trouble you, to disturb you, to make you angry or unhappy?" And then Visākha said, "No, you've always been the very perfect wife, but there's this wandering teacher who's been teaching in the bamboo grove, and I went to listen to him speak. They call him the Buddha, the Enlightened One. And as I was listening to his teaching, I reached such a stage of attainment that I'm completely rid of all sensual desire. So then he said that if you want, I'll just give you your share of the family wealth, and you can go off and marry again, or you can continue to live with me in the house. We've just lived together as brother and sister, whatever you want. And then Dhammadinnā asked whether the Buddha had women ordained disciples. And then Visākha said, yes, there are both bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. And so then Dhammadinnā said, is it possible for me to become a bhikkhuni? And then Visākha said, it seems so, but you have to go and ask yourself. And then she asked, if I wanted to become a bhikkhuni, would you give me permission? And he said, I'd be delighted to let you become ordained as a bhikkhuni. And so she went herself, she went to the bamboo grove, she asked the Buddha for permission to become a nun, the Buddha gave her permission, and then she got ordained as a bhikkhuni. I don't know why Visākha didn't. It would make sense. Now he's free, so he could become ordained as a bhikkhu. I don't know why that didn't happen. Maybe he had some obligations to his parents. The commentary doesn't say anything about them having children, but if they had children, one would think that the mother should take the responsibility for bringing them up. So I don't know, but he remained as a householder, but she got ordained as a bhikkhuni, and then she went off after her ordination to practice meditation very diligently, and before long she attained arhatship. Then when she came back to stay at the bamboo grove, then her former husband, Visākha, sort of wanted to find out how far she's gone in her spiritual development. And so he thought of this, some very questions touching on some very deep, difficult matters in the Dhamma. And so he wanted to test her by asking her these questions. Okay, so now the sutta opens when the lay follower Visākha goes to the bhikkhuni Dhammadinnā. And now since he is a layperson, she is a bhikkhuni, so he pays homage to her. And then he sits down on the side, and then he starts to ask his questions. Okay, so now we're on page 396, and first question he asks, he calls her Aya, which means something like venerable lady. And then he uses a word in Pali. It's very difficult to translate exactly into English to find a satisfactory rendering. But the word is I think maybe they're in the back here. Oh, you have them? Okay. Where was it?
I have not tested yet.
Okay.
Judging from the smell that it's not dry.
Okay, Johnny. Even though it's a foreign word or a Pali word, but it's a word which, in a sense you could say, touches on the most sensitive aspect of our existence. You know, the question, what are you? What am I? to as our identity. So the Pali word is Sakkaya, or Sakkaya, which is made up of the word Kaya, which means body. But it doesn't refer exclusively to the physical body, but it's the body in the sense of a collection of things. Just as we speak about a body of people when there's a group of people. And so the word body, usually we think of it as one thing, the physical body. But the word body can also suggest an assemblage, a collection, a conglomeration. So this is Kaya. Body is the sense of a conglomeration of things. And then it has the prefix Sat, which means existing. So it's the existing body, which you can see why it's difficult to render into English. Some of the earlier translators used to render it as personality. In fact, I did also. But personality usually suggests something like one's character, one's group of character traits. But that's not really the meaning of Sakkaya. Sakkaya is the existing totality of what is a person. So here we use identity. What is your identity? And so the Buddha used this term very often, or quite often in his teaching, to indicate what is a person, or more broadly, what is a living being, a sentient being. And so Visākha is trying to test Dhammadinnā to see how well she understands this important philosophical issue. So then Dhammadinnā explains these 5 aggregates affected by clinging or subject to clinging are called identity by the Blessed One. That is, there's the material form. First I'll read, then I'll go through and explain. That is, the material form aggregate, subject to clinging, the feeling aggregate, subject to clinging, the perception aggregate, subject to clinging, the formations aggregate, subject to clinging, and the consciousness aggregate, subject to clinging. These 5 aggregates affected by clinging or subject to clinging are called identity by the Blessed One. Okay, so when we think about ourselves, about our identity, we usually take ourselves to be what we call a self, to have some kind of solid, substantial, enduring, permanent, real identity. And according to the Buddha, this is like the fundamental delusion, or fundamental mistake in our way of thinking. And so the Buddha looks at the living being, the sentient being, and analyzes the living being into, let's say, 5 types of, maybe it's best to use the word functions, or 5 types of factors which function together in a unison. There are 5 types of factors which are mutually conditioning, very closely interrelated and interdependent. And because they function together in such close unison, because of our ignorance, lack of insight, we grasp upon them as being an existing, single, whole entity, which we take to be myself, my real identity. But the actual identity is this functioning, interrelated combination or assemblage of what are known as the 5 aggregates. And these are the 5 aggregates which are, the important point is that they are subject to upadana. to clinging or grasping. And so we have the 5 aggregates. I use the Pali words so you can get familiar with them, but I'm going to explain them. That's okay, I can use my hand. Till it comes off. Okay, so of course the most obvious factor in our identity, the one that's immediately visible, is material form, what we call the body. But when we look deeply into the body, I know some of you have been with me for years, so you've gone through this again and again, but it doesn't hurt to repeat it. Okay, so what we call the body, it's actually, when the Buddha looks deeply into the nature of the body, he finds it to be a combination of the four material elements. So we have the earth element, which is the property of hardness or solidity. The water element, which is the property of liquidity, fluidity. And it's also said to have the function of cohesion, of binding together the particles of the earth element so that they don't scatter. Then there's the heat element, so we can experience in our own body that our body is always at some temperature, normally 98.6, that one gets a fever. We say the fire element or heat element escalates, and so we get a fever. And then there's the air element or wind element, that we see most obviously in and out breathing. But when we breathe in, then the blood absorbs the oxygen gets distributed to all of the cells of the body. The carbon dioxide, which is also part of the air element, gets expelled from the body at exhalation. And so we have these four primary elements that make up the aggregate of form. And then there are different types of secondary material formations that make up the aggregate of form. The most important of these are the matter that makes up the 5 sense faculties. So according to the Buddha's teaching, we have 5 physical sense faculties. Usually we identify them as the sense organs, the eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. But it's not the actual sense organ that is the sense faculty, but it's rather within the sense organ there's a special type of matter that is sensitive to the corresponding type of sense object. For example, within the physical eye, there's a subtle type of matter which is sensitive to color, light, shape. Maybe in terms of modern physiology, you could identify that with the cones and rods. If we have any medical doctors, please correct me. Any ophthalmologists here? Okay, within the ear, what we call the ear faculty, it's not this mushroom-shaped organ out here, but deep within there is a kind of substance which is sensitive to sound, which picks up vibrations in the air and turns them into sound. And similarly with the nose, again, it's not this little bumpy thing coming out here, but somewhere up here, maybe in this area, there's a subtle type of matter which picks up different types of gases and then turns them into odors. And in the tongue, maybe we call these the taste buds, flavor buds, that turns food objects into taste, or picks up the taste of foods that we eat. Okay, so all of this is included within the form aggregate. Then the feeling aggregate, usually we divide feeling into three types of feelings: pleasant feeling, painful feeling, neutral feeling. And in English, the word feeling suggests something like emotions. But in Pali, the word Vedana has a much more specific sense. It refers not so much to emotion, but what I would call the felt quality of an experience. That is, when we experience anything, sometimes we'll experience it as pleasant. So on that occasion, we would say a pleasant feeling has arisen. On other occasions, we'll experience something and we get it has a painful effect on us. And so on that occasion, we have a painful feeling. But most of the time, there's not a particularly striking pleasant feeling, not a particularly striking painful feeling. So at that time we say that we're experiencing a neutral feeling, a feeling that's not painful, not pleasant. Okay, and then feeling arises through all six of the senses. So through the eye, we can have pleasant feeling, painful feeling, neutral feeling. Through the ear, through the nose, through the tongue, through the body, and with our thoughts in the mind. I could think of something pleasant, maybe a nice beach scene in the Bahamas, wind blowing through the palm trees, waves lapping up gently on the shore. I'm not seeing it, just thinking it with my mind, but when I think of it during this cold, snowy winter, then I get a pleasant feeling. If I think of the heater in my room breaking down, even though it hasn't broken down, but I just think of it, then I get painful feeling. So all of these are things going on in the mind. Or if I imagine somebody yelling at me, blaming me, getting angry with me, again, it's imaginary but painful feeling comes. Okay, so this is the feeling aggregate, all of these, this input of pleasure, pain, and neutral feelings. Then there is the perception aggregate. So what is the specific function of perception? We say the specific function of perception is to seize upon or to pick up on the distinctive quality of an object that is known or experienced. So it's perception that, you could say, selects distinguishing qualities. So if I meet a person for the first time, I've never seen that person before, so my mind will pick up certain features of that person, the way they brush the hair, the way they smile, color of the eyes, the way they dress, and so on. And so all of that goes into my image of that person. So all of this is the work of perception. And then if I see that person again, say I'm walking down the street, I pass that person, sometimes it just takes a split second of seeing that person, and immediately, quicker than I can even think about it, the mind will pick up the features of that person and sort of send it back to the memory bank of that first meeting with the person, and then I recognize, that's the person I met on that occasion. So this is the work of perception. First, it selects distinctive qualities or features of an object and the situation, and then you could say very quickly it labels as a basis for identification. So it also has, on the one hand, it has a sensory aspect in that it relates directly to the sensory experience, and it also has a conceptualizing aspect in that it classifies, labels as a basis for identification. And then we have 6 types of perception, again based on the 6 senses. So there's perception of forms, perception of sounds, odors, tastes, felt sensations, and perception of ideas. Has anybody ate a fruit called durian? Who hasn't eaten the durian? Raise your hand. What? Not yet. So if you've never eaten a durian, then you have no idea what it tastes like. Okay, so there'll be a first time you taste the durian. People sometimes they don't like to eat it because it has a rather pungent odor. It smells a little bit like a mixture of onions and garlic. But it tastes like ice cream. And so if you've never eaten the durian, then when you smell it, you get a perception, this is a perception through the nose, and it's a repugnant perception. But then if you taste it, it has, at least for some of us, it has very delicious taste. So the next time you smell the durian, even though at one level it has a repugnant smell, but then it registers with a pleasant taste, and so then it will awaken the desire to taste it. Okay, the 4th aggregate is called, it's a very vague term, the Sankhara khandha, which means the aggregate of, the word Sankhara can have many meanings, but here it has the meaning of especially volitional activities. That is, states of volition, intention, purpose that arise in the mind and that motivate action. Sometimes they'll motivate bodily action or verbal action, but sometimes they'll just take the form of an evaluation of a situation and some kind of intention with regard to that situation. And so the Buddha's text used the Sankhara aggregate, something like an umbrella term, or it's a kind of big, all-inclusive category to put all the mental factors that don't fit into the other aggregates. So things like greed, hatred, delusion get put into the aggregate of formations. Also the good qualities like generosity, loving kindness, wisdom get put into the aggregate of the mental formations. But the primary factor in the aggregate of formations is volition or intention. The Pali word is cetana. Okay, then the fifth aggregate, we would say, is the chief amongst the five aggregates. This is the aggregate of consciousness. In Pali it's called vijnana. And this is the aggregate, the way I understand it. I take vijnana to be, maybe you can call it the light of awareness that illuminates each objective field corresponding to a particular sense faculty. So the Buddha analyzes or dissects the aggregate of consciousness into 6 types of consciousness. So we have, and they're named after the sense faculty based on which they arise. So we have eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mental consciousness. Now, to exemplify my meaning, the way I understand eye consciousness is the type of consciousness that arises based on the eye, and it sort of lights up the whole field of visible forms. So the reason I'm able to see forms is because the eye faculty has to be functioning. If it were to be damaged so that I'm blind, then consciousness can't arise based on the eye. But if the eye is functioning normally, then eye consciousness arises based on the eye, and it illuminates the whole field of forms. So I can look into the far distance and see trees and hills, mountains. In the far distance, I can look up close and I can see this cup or this pen. I look out and I see all of the people in the class. So all of this field of visual perception is possible because eye consciousness illuminates that field. And then it's perception that picks out the particular features in the visible field as a kind of basis for identification. Then ear consciousness, we could say, illuminates, mixing metaphors, or it opens up the whole field of sounds so that I can hear sounds in the distance. If a dog is barking, I can hear it. I can hear the echoing of my own voice. If I turn on the radio, I can hear the radio. Everything becomes possible, hearing of any kind of sounds with the ear, because of the ear consciousness. And that's the case with the other 3 types of sense consciousness: nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness. But then there's the mind consciousness or mental consciousness, which, the way I see it, it has 2 main functions. One is that the mental consciousness illuminates, let's say the mental consciousness can extend to the objects of all of the other senses. That the mental consciousness is not trapped and confined to its one exclusive type of object. But the mental consciousness can extend to visible objects, to sounds, to taken odors, scents, taste, and so on. So if I have 2 shades of brown, it's the visual consciousness which takes them in, but it's the mental consciousness which relates these 2 shades of brown. In fact, there's even mental consciousness which enables me to know even one object as being brown. The eye consciousness just brings in the color, but the eye consciousness is like a camera. With the camera you can take many pictures, but you ask the camera, what pictures did you take today? It doesn't know anything. You press the memory button on the camera and it'll bring back the pictures that you took. But it doesn't know anything. It just brings in the images. And that is what eye consciousness does. But it's the mind consciousness which starts to make sense out of the pictures, which starts to relate things to one another and to build up a kind of scheme, a system of meanings, attributes, relationships. So that is one function of the mind consciousness. Maybe actually we should say three functions of the mind consciousness. The second would be to relate sensory impressions that come through the different senses, to relate them and coordinate them in order to build up the conception of one object. For example, I might have a red oval-shaped object in front of me, patches of green on it, little specks of yellow and green, with something that we'll call a stem coming out from the top. Then I take that and I bite into it and I get a particular taste, and then I coordinate that particular taste to that particular form. So if I see that form again, then I have a pretty good idea of what kind of taste to expect from that form. So it establishes a relationship between taste and forms. This is the work of the mental consciousness, or it's mental consciousness that makes that possible. Then the third function of the mental consciousness is to know its own distinct class of objects. The mental consciousness can know objects that have nothing to do with the senses. It knows abstract ideas. It deals with thoughts, reasoning, judgments, evaluations. All of this is, we could say, the functioning of the mind consciousness, the mental consciousness. Of course, in reasoning, reflection, evaluation, the mental consciousness will build upon the sensory input, but it can form many abstract concepts based on that sensory input and deal with them at their own level without constant reference to the senses. To illustrate this, I'd like to use an example of, suppose I take an empty bag, I hold it up, you see it's empty, then I have a bunch of oranges in front of me. I take 2 oranges, put them in the bag. I take another 2 oranges, put them in the bag. Then I open the bag, and I take out the oranges, and there are 5 oranges. So you've seen empty bag, 2 oranges went in, another 2 oranges went in, 5 oranges come out. Do you conclude 2 plus 2 equals 5? Somebody does? I think you would conclude either that Bante's a magician, or that there was an orange hidden behind, in the back of the bag, or one of the oranges underwent binary fission when it was in the bag. You don't conclude that 2 plus 2 equals 5, because we know this conceptually to be true. Okay, that's getting a little off track. Okay, so in brief, these are the 5 aggregates. And I have to again emphasize that these 5 aggregates, so we speak about them separately, But in actual life, they always function together as a kind of organic whole, unified whole. Okay, any questions on the five aggregates? Two, three, okay. Okay, one question. When the Buddha declares, not I am, is the Pali word the negation of Sakkaya. No, it's not the negation of Sakkaya, it's the negation of the word I am, which is eso amasmi. And so it said, I am not this, neso amasmi. Two. Okay, I always thought of the aggregate of sankhara as including our emotions, but emotions don't really feel volitional to me. Is this where emotions belong or not? I think we could say that what we call emotions are probably, from a Buddhist standpoint, complex phenomena which involve primarily a component from the aggregate of volitional formations and a component from the aggregate of feeling, mixed, working together. So certain emotions, let us say anger. Okay, anger is an emotion. Actually, anger would be part of the volitional formations. Even though, as I said, in the narrow sense, the sankhara khandha is identified with volition. But the Buddhist texts use the sankhara khandha to include many other mental factors. So many factors that we would call emotions come in the sankhara khandha as the volitional formations or volitional activities. Even though they're not, what's prominent in them is not so much volition, but more the emotional aspect. So anger would be volition. Anger would be an emotion, but it belongs to the volitional formations aggregate. Let us say love, in the sense of personal love, affectionate love, but also I think in my view come into the aggregate of volitional formations.
Wouldn't emotions also have to have a component of recognition, except perhaps for the feeling of the uncanny? Because otherwise, for instance, you can't experience love without having a feeling, without recognizing what you're loving. Right? So you have to have that too, right?
It's been a long time since your 18th birthday. Yeah, but as I said, in emotion, several of these aggregates work together, but probably volitional formations would be the dominant one. But also there would be feeling and recognition or perception. Did somebody take the microphone? Did you want to ask a question?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay, then the third question here. Mental consciousness sounds like the mechanism for perception. I don't like to use the word mechanism because it suggests that mental processes are mechanical, which they're not. But I say that there's a very close connection between the mental consciousness and perception. Since perception is what picks up on the qualities of objects, then it's the mind consciousness, mental consciousness that uses these qualities as a basis for classification, conceptualization, comparisons, establishing relationships. And so yes, they're very closely related. question, can perception be explained as the abstraction or picking out of the major characteristics of a perceived object? Is this how memory works? Yeah, I think that just agrees with what I said. I said that perception is what picks out or selects the most salient or distinctive characteristics of the object perceived. And then that serves as the basis for, first for identification, and then based on identification, recognition can take place, or memory takes place. Okay, let us go on to the next question in the sutta. Okay, now one point that I want to make, very important point, and that is that the Buddha speaks of Sakkaya, personal identity, as being the five aggregates subject to clinging. And what else does the Buddha identify with the five aggregates subject to clinging? You've come across it. Where have you come across five aggregates subject to clinging before?
Dukkha.
Exactly. Dukkha, or the first in the formula for the Four Noble Truths. So when the Buddha is explaining what is the noble truth of dukkha, the noble truth of suffering, then he says birth is suffering, old age, sickness, death, not to get what one wants is suffering. Then in brief, or in short, the five aggregates subject to clinging are dukkha. And the reason is not that the five aggregates are always painful or miserable, but because they're all impermanent, conditioned, and so they don't satisfy the desire or need for something which is unshakable, let's say unshakable, invulnerable basis for happiness. And so they're all considered dukkha. Okay, so now in the next question, Visākha asks Dhammadinnā, he says, lady, it's said the origin of identity, what is called the origin of identity by the Blessed One? Then Dhammadinnā replies, it is craving which brings renewal of being, which is accompanied by delight and lust, which delights in this and that is craving for sensual pleasures, craving for being or craving for new existence, and craving for non-being, craving for annihilation. This is called the origin of identity by the Blessed One. So here, Visākha is asking, how is it that this compound of the five aggregates that makes up our identity, how does this come into being? How does this originate? And then Visākha answers that it is craving that brings it into being. But it might seem, sort of to common sense, well, craving is part of the five aggregates. So how can the five aggregates arise from craving, which is in the five aggregates? How can it do that?
Well, according to dependent origination, craving leads to clinging, or upadana, which leads to bhava, becoming, which then conditions birth. And death, and the whole.
Okay.
How do you pronounce it? Jaram, Marani? I can never.
Jara. Jara is one word.
Jara.
Varana. Yeah, Jara, Varana.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it's actually the craving from the previous existence. Insofar as that craving still remains intact from the previous life, that craving becomes the powerful force which it's still seeking. It's seeking delight, seeking pleasure, enjoyment, and so that craving, when the old body perishes, then the stream of consciousness is still housing, is still accommodating that craving. And so that craving, together with ignorance, together with the karmic formations, builds up the next existence. It's the craving that drives the stream of consciousness into a new form of existence. In the case of the human birth, it will drive it into the mother's womb to link up with a fertilized ovum, and then that will bring the beginning of the fetal development until eventually the child is born and comes out into the world. And so this is how craving, say, constructs, builds up, fashions, fabricates, creates, originates a new existence in the future. And so, once this new life comes into being, one goes through a lot of experiences, a lot of actions, always driven by craving to find some kind of satisfaction, to find delight, pleasure, to satisfy one's cravings. And then as long as that craving is not extinguished, does not yet come to an end, when death takes place, that craving will build up still another existence. And this is how the round of birth and death keeps going from one life to the next, to the next. Okay, so that is really what's taking place here, is that the text is building up the Four Noble Truths, but using Sakhya, personal identity, in the place of the Noble Truth of suffering. So then comes the question, cessation of identity, cessation of identity. How, in other words, how does one stop this process of birth and death? And then Dhammadinnā answers that it's the remainderless fading away, cessation, giving up, relinquishing, and so on, of that same craving. Basically, it's the same formula as the Third Noble Truth. And then the way leading to the cessation of identity, that is spoken of. What is the way leading to the cessation of identity, spoken of by the Blessed One? And then Dhammadinnā answers, it's the Noble Eightfold Path, from right view to right concentration. Okay, all of this is really just the formulas for the Four Noble Truths, now applied to the five aggregates as a composite whole. Okay, now we come to an extremely interesting and important question. Okay, we speak about the five aggregates here as being the five aggregates subject to clinging. So now Visākha asks, is that clinging the same as the five aggregates subject to clinging, or is the clinging something apart from, something separate from the five aggregates subject to clinging? Okay, now we have the five aggregates, and what makes these five aggregates, why they're called dukkha, is because within them there is a clinging to them. And we have to find out what is meant by that clinging. That will come in the answer. Okay, so what is this clinging? Is it something the same as the five aggregates, or something apart from them? Then Dhammadinnā answers, the clinging is neither the same as the five aggregates, nor is clinging something apart from the five aggregates subject to clinging. If clinging were the same as the five aggregates, that would mean that my body itself, the physical body, is just a process of clinging. That every feeling I undergo is a process or an act of clinging. Every perception that I have is an act of clinging. Every mental formation I have is an act of clinging. Every consciousness I have is an act of clinging. In that case, it's impossible to get rid of clinging. And if clinging was something separate from the five aggregates, then I could just have the five aggregates here, and my clinging would be something outside of the five aggregates, which seems nonsensical. But Dhammadinnā answers that it is the desire and lust in regard to the five aggregates subject to clinging that is the clinging there, that is the clinging to them. Now this desire and lust is actually part of one of the five aggregates. Which aggregate does it belong to? Take a guess. No? I heard it back here sometimes. Right, the sankhara aggregate. Yeah, the aggregate of the volitional formations. So it fits into that. It's part of that aggregate. It's not identical with everything in that aggregate. But within the aggregate of volitional formations, one of the factors that fits into that aggregate is clinging. And so that clinging, you could say, it's the hidden demon, Mara, within the five aggregates, which clings to all of them. So it is through that desire and lust within the aggregate of volitional activities that we cling to the body or form. We cling to feelings. We cling to perceptions. We cling to other volitional activities, and we cling to consciousness.
Does the word clinging have any special meaning beyond a dictionary definition of being hanging on to?
Wait, use the microphone. It's coming from.
Does the word clinging have any meaning beyond, let's say, what a dictionary definition would be, which would mean to hang on to?
Okay, first I'll explain it etymologically, then I'll explain the most important form of clinging. Okay, etymologically, the word... Don't need this anymore. This is my clinging. Upadana. Yeah, the Pali word is upadana, which comes from sort of the stem is dana, which means giving. But when it gets the prefix a, it reverses the direction. So it becomes not giving, but taking. And then it has another prefix, upa, which gets blended with that a. So it means something like taking upon oneself, taking towards oneself. So that is the etymological derivation.
What is upa, please, if you were to bring that up? What would upa mean?
Usually it means towards, in the direction of oneself.
Thank you.
But the way upadana functions in regard to the five aggregates, sort of the chief manifestation of upadana is taking the aggregates to the mind, what I am, or myself. And so the way in which we cling to these five aggregates, sort of the most deepest underlying way we cling to them is through, we can call this appropriation, which means taking them to be mine, holding to them, this is mine, my form, my feeling, my perception, my volitions, my consciousness, or else identification, taking them to be what I am, and then when one builds up conceptually on the sense of I am, then one gets the view of a self. One or another of these five aggregates is myself, my real self.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
In the case of non-returner, they get rid of identity view already, but still have conceit.
Yeah.
So the conceit, does it cling on five aggregate or just cling on something? Just has to be something to cling on?
Yeah. The way I would put it, I would say that for the non-returner, there's still a clinging, but the clinging doesn't take the form of, it doesn't manifest in the form of the idea, this is myself, or this is what I am. But there's still a clinging to the five aggregates, but not identifying them so explicitly as mine, I am, or myself.
So still cling on the five aggregates, but know that it's not, I am is not myself, it's not I am.
Yeah. It doesn't have those ideas anymore.
Okay, thanks.
One thing, just to clarify, stream insurer has given up identity view, haven't they?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to come to that, yeah.
Stream insurer, of course, not that.
Okay, now the way I understand it, that the way this clinging operates, this is my own personal theory, it's not in the text. That in different people, according to their temperaments, will tend to cling to different aggregates. And so you can see different personalities based on what type of clinging they have, like maybe the beauty queen, or the bodybuilder, the champion He-Man. For them, the sense of self very strongly attached to the body. So the person who has a very strong sense of physical identification, that's the clinging to the body as I am. And other people sort of wallow in their feelings, maybe the aesthetic type who likes to get uplifted by maybe beautiful music, or the poet carried away by waves of emotion, we say emotion belongs to the aggregate of volitional formations, but just speaking loosely, we could say the person carried away by emotions, or sometimes the person who's carried always wallowing in self-pity. Oh, I'm such a loser, do everything wrong. Or the person the sensualist who likes to enjoy sensual pleasures, that's the person that identifies with feeling. Then maybe the aesthetic person who likes to see beautiful paintings, has very keen aesthetic judgment. Or maybe, that's the kind of person who works through perception, through the senses. And maybe people who like intellectual games, computer programmers, people who are designing new types of computers, work with perception through the mind perception. So that would be the person that identifies with perception. Then the so-called man of action, the business person, the ambitious politician, the one who wants to change the world in his own image, to conquer the world, the military person. Maybe that's the person in whom identification with the aggregate of volitional activities is prominent. And who is the person that identifies with the aggregate of consciousness? Who?
Monk.
The monk. No, we don't identify with anything. Who?
Scientist.
Scientist. Maybe. I was thinking of, could be philosopher.
Carlos Castaneda.
It's been decades since I've read it. Okay, when a yogi, these are some questions. When a yogi practices, this is a bit technical, the kasina meditation, is it the mind consciousness rather than the eye consciousness that works with the object? Yeah, this is the light kasina where you're seeing kind of bright light in meditation. Yeah, this is the mind consciousness, it's not the eye consciousness. Again, this is a bit technical question. Is the craving that's responsible for the origin of identity directly tied to the asava? Are they equivalent? Let's say that if the asavas or the taints, the asava of sensual desire, the asava of craving for existence, would be included within the craving that's the origin of identity. Then, question, how do you not cling to consciousness? It's actually the same question can be asked about all five aggregates. How do you not cling to the aggregates? To do that, you have to develop insight meditation, by which one sees that the five aggregates are first impermanent, then because they're impermanent, they're unsatisfactory. Because they're impermanent and unsatisfactory, they're not mine, not I, not myself. Okay, so I just want to come back to this paragraph. So the clinging, it's not identical with all five aggregates. If it was identical with them, then we could never get rid of clinging. If clinging was separate from the five aggregates, again it would have to exist in a realm of its own. So we would have our five aggregates here, clinging would be something external to us, and again we can never get rid of it because it would always be trailing us because it's separate from us. But the clinging is this desire and lust in the five aggregates, that is in the fourth aggregate, which holds on to the other, to all five aggregates. And so by developing insight wisdom, it's possible to uproot this clinging. And when one uproots the clinging, then one has just the five aggregates, which are no longer subject to clinging. They're the five aggregates which are freed from clinging. And that's why the Buddha often speaks about the goal of his teaching as being the liberation of the mind through non-clinging. Yes, go ahead.
You know, Jung's theory of personality types. I've been trying for some time to figure out the relationship between the aggregates and Jung's theory of personality types in Volume 6 of his collected works. He has two forms of perception, namely intuition and sensation, two forms of judgment, feeling and thinking. He has introversion and extroversion.
Yeah.
I think that the relationship is that he counts extroversion as, or it is pretty much what volition, what sankhara is to the Buddha, and the complete liberation from extroversion and liberation from clinging is what he calls introversion. And then the form, rupa, is, I think, sensation and consciousness, intuition, and feeling, vedana, right? And mental and sana, perceptions, what he calls thinking.
Yeah.
I think that's how it works. And then what the Buddha is asking people to do is pretty much as Jung did, is to orient themselves from an introverted perspective rather than an extroverted one. And the idea of liberation is liberation from clinging to one's relationship to the world and one's dependence on one's on perceptions and thoughts and all that kind of identification is basically the kind of identification that you grew up with in society, where you learn to be or think you are what other people think you are. Right? The extrovert itself, that you have to deal with your persona, and people tend to fit into the roles that they're given. And so the position, I think, of both the Buddha and Jung is that the idea is to outgrow those imposed roles, which all fit with volition and extroversion.
Yeah, though I'm always a little bit wary about trying to push comparisons too far, because one always will come across points where the comparisons don't hold exactly. And of course, say in developing meditation, it's a kind of looking inward, so you can call it an introversion, but it's not a settling or taking something within oneself to be the self. A normal introvert could also have a very strong problem of clinging.
Is the movement here from being Is the movement here, the movement from clinging to non-clinging, is it a movement from being self-centered to becoming more external-centered? Or you understand what I'm saying? Like a child is very, very self-centered. Yeah. And as one gets older, one becomes less ego-centered.
Yeah.
And can see things from a different perspective.
Definitely it's a matter of becoming less self-centered, though it's not necessarily a matter of, say, becoming involved with a lot of other people in the sense of being sociable or gregarious.
No, it's a change in perception.
Yeah.
As opposed to, somebody would say one is culturally centric and one only can see things from one's cultural point of view. Yeah. And as you develop, you begin to see it in a different, in a more objective sense. Yeah. Rather than just from your own eyes or your own senses.
Yeah. Okay, I think we'll end the discussion for the day here. Since we just started the Sutta, I'm not going to have the discussion after lunch today, but we'll have, after we get through a substantial part of the Sutta, then we can have the after lunch discussion, perhaps next week. But we'll continue with it next week. That's the 22nd. And then I'll have a class on the 29th. Originally I didn't have a class, but since we missed last week's class, we can reschedule for the 29th. So you see, this is quite a rich and quite deep sutta dealing with very important and interesting points. Okay, so we'll end with the sharing of the merits. Okay, so we share the merits with the Devas, the Nagas, the Buddhas, wishing them to rejoice, to protect the Buddha's teachings, to protect the world, to protect ourselves and others. Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyanta Nanamodikva Shiram Rakantu Sasanam Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahitika Punyanta Nanamodikva Shiram Rakantu Sasanam Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyanta Namodikva Shiram Rakantu Manparam Etavatacha Hehi Sampadam Punya Sampadam Sabbe Devanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Etavatacha Hehi Sampadam Punya Sampadam Sabbe Bhutanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Etavatacha Hehi Sampadam Punya Sampadam Sabbe Satanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Bhavagupadaya Vichitato Ekantare Satakayupapana Rupya Rupicha Asanya Sanino Tukha Pamuchantu Pusantu Niputi